So thanks for joining me today. I'm going to talk about Marshall's A and B mills in Holbeck, Leeds. There's some other mills there as well, mills C, D, E and the Temple mill, but I'm focusing today on the A and B mills. As Tesha said, my name's Ashley Tuck. I'm a senior research officer at Wessex Archaeology, and I had the pleasure of writing up the publication for this site, which appeared in the CBA Yorkshire Forum. I didn't do the field work. My colleague Emily Eastwood led that, and there was a team of archaeologists. They seem to remember the site very fondly, saying it was one of the best sites they dug on. So hopefully you'll find this interesting today. The site's got a strong story, an important story, and there's a lot to cover. We're grateful to the consultants ECUS for commissioning the work on behalf of the developer CEG, and of course to WIAS for monitoring the project, the West Yorkshire Archaeology Service, particularly David Hunter. His comments on the draft publication were very useful. So these are flax mills. This is where the plant flax is turned into linen cloth. A couple of pictures there of a field of flax and a handkerchief or something. In the late 18th century, wool and cotton had been successfully mechanized, but flax was a more difficult fiber and linen was still being produced by hand. There had been advances in bleaching and in weaving linen, but these could not be fully exploited due to a bottleneck in the supply of yarn. Production had become more urban, but it was still being done using the same old small-scale, labor-intensive methods. So the linen industry was very much poised to undergo a transformation. It was ready for mechanization. And in Darlington in County Durham, which had become a centre of linen manufacture, two industrialists had patented a method for the mechanical spinning of flax in 1787. However, their method was expensive and it produced only low quality yarn, and it wasn't really a viable method. So here's the, not going to say the hero of our story, but definitely the protagonist of the story is John Marshall. He described his family as respectable country gentlemen. They were non-conformists with family connections within the linen industry, within textile manufacture, but they were outsiders to the oligarchical corporation of the boom town of Leeds. And at the age of 22, quite a young age, John Marshall's father passed away, and the young man inherited his father's estate, which chiefly comprised business as a linen merchant. The young John Marshall decided to use this start to investigate the mechanization of linen production. He obtained permission to use the Darlington patent and conducted 3 years of experiments at Scotland Mill, Adel, which is near Leeds outside. The other character essential to the mechanization of linen production is Matthew Murray. His name will be familiar to maybe to some of you as a pioneer of steam engines. He built the first commercially viable steam locomotive, and later Matthew Murray operated from the Round Foundry, which was situated next door to Marshall's Mills in Holbeck, Leeds. Indeed, he purchased the land from John Marshall for the Round Foundry. But for now, the unknown Matthew Murray was merely a young metalsmith in Marshall's employment. He came to lead and guide Marshall's experiments until Murray was able to patent a reliable method for spinning good quality flax yarn. So it took about 3 years for John Marshall to conduct these experiments, and it was pretty much only with Matthew Murray's input. Murray was actually very quick when he got onto the job, that they were able to produce a viable method. So in 1790, Marshall left the disadvantageously situated Scotland Mill and he set up his operation in Holbeck. So this figure shows the location of the mills. The A mill is here and the B mill was over here. And we can see we're in Holbeck in Leeds, and that's where it is in Yorkshire. The site had several advantages. It had good transport links to the international linen trade. They imported flax from Russia and traded internationally. It had great availability of cheap urban labour, and it also had access to cheap coal. So it was an ideal place for an undertaking like this. The archaeological results reveal that the site may have been prepared for development prior to Marshall's purchase. There was a substantial sandstone and lime mortar wall, this one here, 1010, which was parallel to the Holbeck. The river, the Holbeck, just runs across the south of this figure here. It's not drawn on, but it's just about there. And there was accumulated alluvium, river deposits, on the south side of the wall, which revealed that the wall defined the limit of the flood limit of the river. And the construction of the mill postdated this alluvium. So wall 1010 was there for some time before the mill was built. And as you can see here, some buildings of the mill were situated between the wall and the river, suggesting there'd been a change in strategy of land use. That may have coincided with a change in ownership when Marshall bought the land. And there was also a series of drains there and here. These were probably contemporary with the wall 1010. It may be that the wall and the drains were constructed by a previous owner. Marshall purchased the site from a William Naylor, and it could have been him who commissioned these works. It may have been designed to make the site look attractive for development. Yeah, sometimes when you're researching archaeological sites, you get dealt a bad hand, and sometimes you get a great hand. Rarely have I found a source as useful as W.G. Rimmer's 1960 economic history, Marshals of Leeds, Flax Spinners, 1788 to 1886. It's an absolute joy of a book. It's well written, it's readable, it's full of accurate information. It's a bit dated in its approach. Much of what I'm telling you today I owe to this book. And you can see here, next to the Holbeck, we've got this dry house. A dry house is a store, and that is these buildings here that we excavated archaeologically. Now, these look very much like a row of cottages. They've got domestic fireplaces. There was a staircase coming up here. So I wonder if these were originally workers' housing that have been repurposed as a dry house, as a store, or maybe we should take dry house a bit more literally. Perhaps these are stores in dwelling-like buildings, maybe. So excuse me, the four-storey Mill A was completed by September 1791, merely 16 months after the purchase of the land. No expense was spared, and Marshall himself later thought that he had lacked caution during the construction of the mill. Sadly, there were no remains from the main part of Mill A that survived. However, the foundations for a building at the rear of Mill A, contemporary with Mill A, did survive, and these were later incorporated into the main mill building. So initially this was a separate building, and then later the gap between the buildings was filled in. The mills were mainly constructed of handmade bricks and lime mortar. They had stone foundations, flagstone floors. Heating was provided by at least one fireplace. There was a porch on the north side here. You can see this little porch, and the thresholds going in to it's maybe a rear entrance to the mill. We'll look at some of the mill in detail. There were letters between John Marshall and his investor Samuel Fenton in 1792, which revealed that Mill A was initially powered by water. This was raised from the Holbeck by a Newcomen type atmospheric engine. Some of you perhaps will be familiar with a Newcomen engine. You might have visited an example somewhere. It's a big beam, and this engine was used to raise water from the river, and then the water would be in a tank and it would fall by gravity turning a wheel. So the engine is not directly powering the mill, but only indirectly. Bit of a long-winded way to get power to modernise. And Marshall saw this, I think, because after a mere 6 months, he began negotiating for a 20 horsepower Boulton and Watt steam engine to directly power the mill. This is quite exciting because it's the first rotative engine to be employed in a textile mill. So just, when you think of a 20 horsepower engine, it seems like nothing, does it? I drive quite a modest car, but it is much more powerful than this steam engine that is being relied upon to drive, this entire factory. Now, I can't be certain, but I think these red parts here, see those. I think those are the remains of a chimney, but they are the remains of a chimney, and I think that these are associated with the 1792 Boulton and Watt engine. It seemed unlikely that these are associated with the original atmospheric engine, so this chimney is on the wrong side of the mill, it's away from the river, and if this is the chimney of the 1792 engine, we know that it was probably removed in 1821 when a more powerful 40 horsepower engine made by Matthew Murray was installed. So this ties in. You can see that this chimney here has been truncated by later development. So that could be the development in 1821 when the new engine went in. And that ties in with the adoption of a new type of spinning frame, the gill frame, when the underdrawings, this ground floor level of the mill, may have been rearranged to accommodate changes in the flax processing. And that could be the changes we can see there. Because there's this yellow thing here, this thing I've drawn in yellow that's coming through. It's a rather strange subterranean passageway. So you've got the chimney and then this passageway, and it snakes its way between the existing structures. Here's a photo of my colleague Sam Birchall. He's excavating in the sunken passageway. You can see there's some bricks down here. They may be the base. There's a bit more to come out here. So you can see it illustrates quite nicely that the passageway was low. It's about 1.5 meters high, which could explain why 49% of Marshall's employees in 1831 were children under the age of 15. So I imagine young children running up and down this passageway. It's probably used to take maybe waste products out of the mill, or it could be finished articles, or maybe yarn or something. I think it's probably waste products because they would have come down these chutes, these sloping brick structures, to fall in the bottom of the passage, which presumably was badly lit and quite claustrophobic. And just imagine these children running up and down. It's not what I want for my children. Yeah, so Murray and Marshall solved the problem of spinning linen yarn in 1789, but the raw flax still required a lengthy preparation process. These photos show the 3 stages. We've got breaking over here. The flax plant is in here, and it's being broken by this lever, or you don't need this to do it. You can do it a bit more primitively. And then the second stage is scutching. He's whacking the plant with this tool. And the most important stage is hackling or heckling. Whether it's got an E or an A in it, it doesn't matter, it's the same thing. So you can see he's pulling the fibers through this arrangement of nails, and it's hackling the fibers. So with the mechanization of spinning linen yarn, heckling became the bottleneck in linen production. Marshall and Murray had been experimenting with mechanized heckling as well as its alternative carding. They're both processes which comb the fibers. The distinction is a bit of a fine one, I think, between the distinction between heckling and carding. So they've been experimenting with this right from the start, but they were only successful quite late on. Again, it was Murray that made the innovation. It seems very simple, but it was a wet sponge contacting the fibers that made all the difference. And this machinery, this mechanized heckling machinery, was introduced between 1808 and 1815. But then this was quickly replaced by a new form of spinning frame, the gill frame. I mentioned that earlier, which combed the flax as it entered the frame. This gill frame, this technology, the gill frame, was invented by a small-scale spinner in Darley-Dale, Derbyshire. I don't know the spinner's name, but they were able to keep this new technology secret from the big names of the linen business for a few years before it was discovered. I think that'd make a good plot for a film. Almost writes itself. But get in touch if you want the rights to them. So this is the flagstone floor inside part of Mill A. There are some circular wear patterns there. You can see them, there's a couple on there. They're a bit hard to pick out maybe in the webinar. Over the course of operation, Mill A contained a variety of machinery. They had the initial spinning frames, the heckling frames, drawing frames. The frames required replacement after about a decade. They lasted about 10 years before they were worn out, and their maintenance was one stiff and constant job, according to John Marshall's son, John Marshall II. And then obviously the heckling machines were introduced, and then the gill frames. So a whole variety of different equipment may have been in here, and these may have caused these circular wear marks on the floor. We also uncovered the remains of some ancillary buildings associated with Mill A. Preservation was locally variable. It was really good in some spots, and then next door there was nothing surviving. Rimmer, who wrote the book I mentioned, says that several other buildings went up before the end of 1792. A large flax warehouse, a counting house, stables, a dry house, shops for smiths and joiners, and several cottages. The mill yard was paved and walled around. In the heckler's shop, there were 60 yards of bench. There were tools in the machine shops, office equipment, and 2 horses. There was a whole load of stuff going on, not just the central factory, all kinds of buildings and activities. The northeast boundary of the Mill A plot was defined on an 1815 map by a range of buildings, of which fragments were revealed by excavation. It's difficult to correlate these with specific activities. However, it can be said that materials were stored or processed in these areas, and that changes in the ground level were employed to facilitate the movement of material. The image shows a raised loading ramp. It's half a metre higher than this adjacent flagstone surface. We've got 2 parallel lines of flagstones on that would have accommodated a cart, and then there's also cobblestones and these walls. The loading ramp provided access this way to a building, not quite in the photo. It was evidenced by 14 metres of the foundations of the front wall only. The back wall was gone. And it had a double width doorway divided by a central wooden post. There's a lot of fragments of building like this. I'm just going to skim over them because it's just a bit of wall here and a few bricks there. But I do want to say about this photo that I find it very evocative. This shot was taken by Emily Eastwood, who ran the excavation. I'm very pleased she's become a manager with Wessex. The photo reminds me of working in my 20s when I go from one of these industrial sites to another. Nowadays, I just sit at a desk. So the operation benefited from a large warehouse. Marshall was a merchant before he was an industrialist or an innovator, and the firm was able to leverage its large storage space to buy raw materials and to sell finished products when the market price was favourable. The foundations of the warehouse, these structures here, were particularly deep, about 1.2 metres, which perhaps suggests something of the importance of this building to the operation. Excavation revealed that the warehouse was expanded to the east and that the south end was truncated prior to it being mapped in 1850. Marshall's investors had no further money to invest in the business, and the economic circumstances of war with France provided Marshall with the opportunity to say that he was making a loss. He wrote this loss off against his investors' capital, later writing, "As they could neither of them be any further use, I released them from the concern." So he took their money, and that was it. Marshall was able to find new investors, and with this capital, he built Mill B. I'm both impressed by his audacity and a little bit judgmental of his mercenary economic practice there. So Mill B was initially built in a similar manner to Mill A. It was 2 or 3 times larger. It was initially powered by a 28 horsepower Bolton and Watt steam engine, and as with Mill A, it was the rear parts of the structure that survived. So on this aerial photo here, these structures here are part of Mill B, and as are these small walls down here. Mill B would have extended into this area, but it's been truncated by these later structures. These things that I'm pointing at right now are all later. They all post-date the mill. So this block here is the main survival of the foundations of Mill B. As with Mill A, there was a subterranean vaulted passageway running here away from the camera. In the case of Mill B, it was unclear if this was part of the original construction. The passageway was truncated by a series of brick platforms. These look like they were intended to carry some weight. Could it be that a steam engine was located here? A second 30 horsepower Murray engine was fitted in 1799, and in 1814 a 56 horsepower engine was installed. It's unclear whether that replaced the earlier engines or was an addition, and that came in at the same time as the mechanised heckling equipment. Gas lighting was also added at the same time, and then again the arrangement was changed when gill frames were introduced. Here's another view of Mill B. So we were looking from over there previously, and now we're looking from this other direction. It's possibly these firebrick chutes here may have carried ash from a steam engine situated up here. It's all a bit conjectural. We don't know that for certain. The base of any steam engine did not survive. We can't really link any of the structural changes in Mill B directly to the historically attested rearrangements. We can't really do better than to just say that the technological changes probably prompted these modifications. We can't tie specific structures in with specific historic events. So after only 5 months of operation, Mill B caught fire in 1796. 7 workers were killed and another 20 injured when one of the walls of the mill collapsed. Rebuilding began immediately, and it was complete in another 5 months, very quick turnaround. The fire was said to have started in the dry house and spread through the heckling shops into the mill. The location of the heckling shops, heckling, same thing, we know that from historic records. It was here. We don't know what this building was up here. Could this be the dry house where the fire started? We think these down here were perhaps Smith's accommodation. This further range up here might have been where the fire started. It might have come around into Mill B potentially. Before Wessex Archaeology undertook mitigation excavation of the site, a trial trench evaluation was done by Northern Archaeological Associates, NAA. This recorded that the sandstone foundation of the heckling shop had been discoloured pink by heat, and it had been rebuilt, slightly enlarging the original structure. This is the only archaeological evidence that might represent the fire. The majority of the observed remains may therefore either represent the rebuild after the fire, or perhaps more likely they may be undamaged parts of the original building. Marshals began to develop south of Water Lane with a dry house, a counting house and mechanics shop built in 1806. Mill C followed. You can see here on this plan from Rimmer, you've got the Mill C and the dates, Mill D, Mill E, and then the Temple Mill. It's I don't know what word to use. It's such a strong building. This Egyptian-themed Temple Mill. It's rather a famous building. These are all still standing. The Temple Mill and Mills C, D, and E. They've been subject to restoration and renovation in recent years. They're outside the area of excavation, obviously, and unfortunately, they're sort of outside the scope of our work and this talk. But I can say something about the demolition of Mills A and B. The sunken passageway in Mill A was bricked up at some point. It may be that this was during a period when it stood empty prior to demolition. Letters reveal that the demolition of Mill A was planned from at least 1829, and there were no frames in the mill by 1835, and then demolition was complete by 1837. So it stood empty for a number of years. Mill B survived a little bit longer. There were still some frames in place in 1835, and 6 experimental looms for weaving rather than spinning were installed in 1843. So some degree of normal operation was probably ongoing, because you wouldn't have just run a steam engine just for the sake of 6 experimental looms. Mill B was eventually demolished in 1852. And these mills were considered to be old-fashioned by this time, and they were not up to sort of the standards needed by the evolving technology of linen spinning. John Marshall withdrew from business in 1842, and he died in 1845, aged 80. Rumour reveals that the business became unprofitable after 1850. And he has a wonderful quote from Rimmer's book. In contrast to the managerial success of the elder John Marshall, Rimmer says this about his descendants. He says, the third generation actively despised the firm, whereas their fathers had merely neglected it. Very, very harsh words. He obviously backs that up with evidence. So there was definitely a decline in the firm after John Marshall's death, which came, around about the time when Mills A and B were being demolished. By this time, the members of the Marshall family lived in grand properties in the Lake District, including at Derwent Island. I think that's quite a famous one near Keswick. People will go out on a boat and visit that, and other properties on Ullswater and elsewhere. The money John Marshall had made in Holbeck brought the family 3 generations of luxury, but by the 4th generation it had run out. The firm was shut down in 1886, and the mills and land were sold for a pittance. We also uncovered the remains of a few things that occupy the site of Mills A and B at later dates. I don't have time for lots of detail about these, but I'll just say a few things about some of them. In 1882, the Holbeck Viaduct, a railway viaduct, was constructed through the west end of the site, and the railway brought with it a series of stables, these structures here. We know they're stables from historic maps and that they were owned by the railway. It's interesting that the railway still needed horses. And there was also this turning shop, which was later a warehouse. And there's these structures in the bottom here, which are these structures. And this is the base for a Lancashire boiler, probably. So another steam engine here. And it's interesting to consider the change from the cutting edge innovation of Marshall's factory, of his Mills A and B, to this, the fully developed form of an integrated works, a proper Victorian factory, or early 20th century perhaps. So yeah, to contrast the sort of more experimental version of a factory that Marshall built to this well-developed, sort of well-understood factory. Environmental samples taken from the site were expected to contain flax remains. You'd expect bits of flax on the site of a flax mill. However, nothing survived. This was due to the conditions on site. They were not suitable for the preservation of environmental remains, so we didn't get any flax seeds or anything like that. The artifacts from the site are quite interesting. Here we've got some bone knife handles, very beautiful objects, but they don't really further the story of Marshall's mills. They represent waste material from the city of Leeds, and they were probably mostly imported following demolition of the mills. They don't relate to Marshall's activity on site. Most interesting perhaps were we had a few pottery wasters, so pieces of pottery from pottery production, bits of pottery that hadn't been made perfectly. We had some glass manufacturing waste, these knife handles. We had a few leather shoes, which an expert, Keita Mould, has said represent cobbling waste, so the recycling of old shoes. And we also had some school writing slates. Obviously, there's no school on the site. All of this stuff has been imported in material that's been used to level the ground rather than representing activity on the site itself. We didn't get any bits of spinning frame. The frames were subject to constant maintenance, and it's easy to imagine that any working frames would have been transferred to the other mills, with perhaps any older, more worn frames being broken up and maybe their parts were recycled. Already have time, yeah, about 1:45. Yeah, so that's about it, I think. Marshall's mills provided employment for a few thousand urban workers. This varied between 1 and 3,000 depending on the year, including a large proportion of children. They were all expected to work long hours, and they were paid static and decreasing amounts of money. They were expected to work in strict regimes that expected them to behave in as mechanical a way as the frames that they worked, and as a result there was a high turnover of staff. The mills were dynamic and adaptable structures that developed in reaction to technological and economic circumstance. They evolved in a piecemeal fashion as needs and space dictated, with no overarching plan. Eventually, progress outstripped the usefulness of the mills, and after several phases of remodelling, they were finally abandoned. Apart from the less successful ventures in Darlington and Marshall's experiments at Scotland Mill, Mill A represents the first mechanised flax mill, the first successful mechanised flax mill. Though flax was never as extensively exploited as wool or cotton, Marshall's mills are emblematic of industrial innovation, and they represent a major contribution to the Industrial Revolution and to Leeds. The flax industry made an important contribution to the economy and the development of the city of Leeds, and is one example of the engineering excellence of the city. So that's about it for my talk. I think we've got some time for questions.
Thank you very much for that talk, Ash. It's really interesting. And yes, we do have time for questions. So please pop your questions in the question box and we'll go through them. So we did have one question come in through the talk, so I will start with that one. So this question is about the archaeology, and was it over a water channel or from the water wheel? And was the wheel pit found?
Yeah, the wheel pit wasn't found. It was probably in the area that was truncated to the south. If we're talking about the Millet wheel pit, it's probably truncated to the south. And that's really interesting what you said about a water channel. It's something I glossed over during my talk. But after the mills were demolished, a large, probably brick culverted channel was dug through the centre of the site, sort of diagonally between mills A and B, and that's still there under the ground. We stayed away from that during the archaeological works because we didn't want to impact that, and it will be there buried beneath the ground once the site is developed. So yeah, the hydrological arrangements of the site are quite interesting. Obviously, you've got the Holbeck to the south. There were some large reservoirs to the south of Water Lane, to the south of the Holbeck, and then these were infilled, and that culverted buried channel that I just spoke about was built to replace those. So yeah, quite complex and changing over time, the way that they brought water into both mills A and B and the mills to the south of the Holbeck.
Okay.
Did that answer the question? Did I cover all the bits?
I think so, and I can just see that the person who asked the question's got their hand up, so I will unmute them. We won't be able to see them, but we should be able to hear them, so we'll see if they can add any more to the question.
Great.
So I've just unmuted you, Mark. So would you like to say any more about the question? Nash's comments?
It struck me that there seemed to be a sinuously shaped channel which could have been wide enough for water. I suppose you'd be able to tell if it had a puddle lining or something like that, which would have retained the water within it if it was a water channel. But I don't think the idea that small children walked under it to do something or other really holds water. So my suspicion is that what you showed is a route for water either being carried away from the power source or taken to it.
Yeah, okay, that's very interesting. Yeah, yeah. I mean, there was no clay lining or anything within it, and it didn't sort of slope down in any direction. It was level. But yeah, I can see what you're saying.
The first cotton mill in Manchester was excavated, which recirculated water by a steam engine over a water wheel. And so it might be worth comparing with what was found there. And there are a couple of locations, I'm calling from Scotland, where I think it would be possible to find something of a similar arrangement from the 1790s. So atmospheric engine pumps water over a water wheel, and then it goes back again, with some of it going back into the river, but more of the water being recirculated.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident that sinuous passageway postdates the atmospheric engine on the site, because it's been inserted into the earlier structures that are there. But yeah, I'm not dismissing your idea. I think that's very interesting, and I'm very grateful for your contribution.
So thank you for sharing that with us in the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Mark, for speaking to us. It's very nice to hear a voice as well, other than mine and Ash's in these webinars. So there is a put your hand up function, and then I can unmute you if you would like to ask a question out loud. I've had a few more questions coming in through the chat box as well, so I will quickly have a look at those too. And remember, got a few more minutes for questions, so if you do want to ask a question, please do pop it in the chat box now. Oh, so someone's come back to the harvesting question and shared their opinion, and they think it would have been harvested by pulling the flax from the ground.
Great.
And then one question on the site now and kind of what's happened to it, and anything you can tell us about the future of the site.
Yeah, so most of the work we do is ahead of redevelopment. That's how commercial archaeology is funded. So the site is planned for redevelopment. They may have even have started, and I'm not sure. So it will be built on and um, redeveloped. So yeah, it's always quite kind of sad when you think of the remains being not visible or not preserved. But at least we get the chance to look at them, and we get to preserve them by records. All of the work we do is archived with the local museum, and it'll be available there for future researchers. And obviously the publication and the reporting that we've done on it is available to read.
I think, yeah, we tend to see sites for a very short period, don't we? And when we're doing the archaeology, we see them for the archaeological works, and then they kind of get handed over to the developer, and we're a bit disconnected from what happens next to them in a way. So that was the last question I've had coming in. So thank you everyone so much for asking your questions and the discussion, and thank you very much to Ash for the wonderful talk and presentation and answering the questions.